Aye.
Notice of motion number 5, that the Legislative Council notes recommendation 12.1 contained in the Commission of Inquiry into the Tasmanian Government's responses to child sexual abuse in institutional settings final report dated August 2023, which states the Tasmanian Government should close Ashley Youth Detention Centre as soon as possible. Ms Webb.
The honourable member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr President. Picking up where I left off prior to the break, I was saying it's not just me saying that AYDC is fundamentally and systemically contravening the rights of our children and young people. It's not just Taskforce, nor the Children's Commissioner, nor even the Custodial Inspector. It is the United Nations Committee Against Torture stating this. That is what our application of a laser focus tells us. Which brings us, Mr President, to the question of what is required to protect children from the immediate and continued risk of harm at AYDC, identified by the Commission of Inquiry, and to restore their human rights as soon as possible. As detailed in sections 1B, C, D and E in the motion before us, there have been multiple urgent offers of help by those with relevant experience in the community sector and civil society organisations. For the benefit of the public record, and for those who may be listening, I'll provide a brief summary of those offers. On the 6th of October last year, barely 10 days after the public release of the Commission of Inquiry's final report, a letter emphasising the urgent action required to address the emergency at Ashley Youth Detention Centre was sent to the Premier, the Ministers Guy Barnett, Roger Yench and Madeleine Oakleby. This letter was signed by 15 organisations and individuals with expertise in this area. This letter states, and I quote, "We remain extremely concerned for the safety of the children currently held at Ashley Youth Detention Centre, particularly considering the final report confirms there are current and live risks for detainees and recommended its urgent closure. It has now been 2 years since former Premier Peter Gutwein announced the closure of Ashley, yet it seems we are still no closer to a date. Waiting any longer for change is unacceptable." And further, Mr President, I quote, "This is an emergency. The government must act now to uphold the rights of all Tasmanian children and ensure they are safe. The closure of Ashley is just the first step." The signatories proposed a multidisciplinary working group to be developed consisting of members of civil society organisations, community practitioners and experts in the fields of child safety and youth justice to progress the urgently needed reforms. On the 11th of October, this coalition of organisations publicly released an open letter to the Premier, reiterating the need to close AYDC as a matter of urgency, along with the appointment of a specialist forensic experts to assess all detained children and the development of a multidisciplinary working group to assist now rather than wait until the government's proposed new models are in place. On the 13th of November last year, Taskforce, 54 Reasons, Colony 47 and Anglicare wrote to Minister Yench again, calling for the establishment of a multidisciplinary working group. Then on the 22nd of May this year, the Commissioner for Children and Young People issued a public statement calling for urgent action by the government on AYDC, including the establishment of a special task force to reduce the number of children held on remand at that institution. Mr President, most recently, it is my understanding that all state MPs received an open letter from the CEO of Taskforce on the 7th of June, last week, reiterating the need, or some weeks ago, the need for urgent action to address the emergency at AYDC. This letter states, and I quote, "We have no reason to believe AYDC is a safe place for children. We must act now and work collaboratively to support Tasmanian children and their families." This letter reiterates that Tasmanian community organisations have written to the government on multiple occasions offering to work collaboratively to address the needs of those children currently detained. Mr President, members would have noticed a theme emerging here over the last 8 months. It simply doesn't stack up for the government to argue that the Commission of Inquiry's recommendation that AYDC is closed as a matter of urgency cannot occur until 2026, 2 years after the government's original promise, while also appearing to ignore repeated requests and offers by community sector and civil society organisations to work collaboratively right now to find ways to avoid children and young people being put at risk in this widely recognised unsafe institution. As Taskforce said last week, we have no reason to believe AYDC is a safe place for children. This brings us to the crux of the motion before us, as outlined by section 2 of that motion. We have at least 15 community sector organisations and civil society individuals and organisations with expertise in the areas of youth justice and child safety, plus the Children's Commissioner, both calling for an urgent multidisciplinary task force to address the immediate situation to be established, as well as being on standby to assist on that task force. We cannot afford to turn our back on this very practical offer. The children and young people currently and potentially incarcerated at AYDC cannot afford us to continue to turn our back on this offer. For over 8 months, the sector has repeatedly referred to the AYDC situation as an emergency. The government has continued to claim the welfare and well-being of our children is paramount, which begs the question, Mr. President, what is the problem? Why hasn't this offer, as proposed back in October last year, not been embraced and taken up by the government? 1,013 days since the promise was made to close AYDC, and we find ourselves here now urging the government to heed the request of the community service providers with expertise in this area. And as noted in the motion before us, I'm very conscious that the initial focus of any such emergency multidisciplinary task force formed is to prioritise children on remand. We're all very conscious that this is a partial, albeit important and essential step. Those who have received a custodial sentence must also not be forgotten or relegated to some other not as important status. However, under our judicial system, which is predicated on the presumption of innocence until proven guilty, it's unconscionable for those still being presumed innocent to be incarcerated in these unacceptable conditions, which are widely recognised as unsafe, especially if other options can, in fact, be made available. I cannot help but note, Mr. President, that had the Premier acted immediately, he received the first letter of the concerned community sector offering to share their expertise to assist. And just to remind honourable members, that letter was dated the 6th of October last year. The work called for in the motion before us today could have been underway, I think, 257 days ago. 8 months and 18 days ago, children who are still presumed innocent on remand could have been benefiting from the shared expertise, skills and dedication of a multidisciplinary task force working in collaboration with the government services. To reiterate, the Premier and the responsible ministers received the final report from the Commissioners on the 30th of August last year, which clearly highlighted the fact this was an emergency situation, that they regarded children to be at risk at AYDC. 257 days ago, the Premier and responsible ministers were offered expert help to deal with this situation. Yet, by all accounts, that offer was largely ignored. Apparently, late last week, following the same group of community sector organisations writing the letter to all state MPs I mentioned earlier, a government request for a meeting was received, and I believe that a meeting has been held, in fact, yesterday. That only took approximately 8 months and 2 weeks from the initial emergency call made on the 6th of October, late last year, Mr. President. Laser focus, indeed. I have no doubt in the government's contribution on this motion, we will hear a laundry list of actions being taken to implement the recommendations of the Commission of Inquiry, including actions being taken to progress the redesign of the youth justice system. There's nothing this government likes more than giving us a long list of actions or commitments to distract us from those areas in which they have a shameful lack of outcomes or results. No one, let me be clear, Mr. President, no one is accusing the government of doing nothing in this space or of not being busy progressing numerous important recommendations from the Commission of Inquiry. But the fact of the matter is, the Commissioners said close AYDC as a matter of urgency, that they had grave concerns for the safety and wellbeing of all detainees at the centre. Given that unequivocal advice from expert commissioners who'd immersed themselves for close to 2 years in evidence of the shocking abuse being perpetrated on children at that institution and the extensive and shameless enablement of that abuse, the government have not and are not acting with urgency, not with sufficient urgency, to keep children from that harm. That is what this motion is about. It's worth considering, Mr. President, that actually it is not only AYDC former or current detainees who receive a record. In the eyes of many, we all carry an Ashley Youth Detention Centre record. Former governments and parliaments, the current government and current parliament, everyone who has allowed these crimes against children and young people continue on their watch must bear the record of that shame. And thanks to the brave whistleblowers who were the catalyst for the Commission of Inquiry, and also thanks to the work of the Commission of Inquiry itself, this Parliament is in a unique position. We cannot say we did not know. We cannot say we do not know. Now it is on our watch, government and non-government members, all of us. No excuses were washed, Mr President. To put it bluntly, AYDC is Tasmania's point pure of the modern era. I do not make that comparison lightly. Instead, it reflects a deep shock, sadness and profound horror in light of the experiences people have had in that place, which some have shared with me. AYDC is an ever-growing, immutable stain of shame on the records of former governments, the current government and this Parliament. Mr President, I mentioned the sadness and horror I felt and continue to feel the more I discover about what has occurred at AYDC, and I have no doubt that barely scratches the surface. But I can also add anger to that list. I'm angry on behalf of those children and young people sent to AYDC who have been subjected to appalling abuse, many of whom will never receive justice for what was done to them, nor the recognition of how it continued to destroy their lives, relationships and opportunities long after. I'm angry on behalf of those honourable workers and others who tried to alert us things were gravely wrong, who exhausted themselves and risked their own safety while ringing that alarm bell. And I'm also angry that this has been occurring and continues to occur on my watch. I had the privilege of being elected to this place in 2019, Mr President, and over the past 5 years it has become glaringly clear that despite independent reviews, promises by premiers and commissions of inquiry recommendations, we are still failing to protect those vulnerable children and young people for whom the state has a duty of care. Every single day that AYDC stays open, we fail in that duty of care to protect those children. And I'm so very angry to realise that the state received offers of expert assistance for at the best interim measures 8 months ago, but apparently chose to ignore those offers. To conclude, Mr President, I wish to acknowledge the strength, bravery and commitment of the whistleblowers, carers, organisations and individuals, most importantly the victims, survivors, the former and current AYDC detainees who have all placed themselves on the line and by doing so risked greater and ongoing harm to themselves in their efforts to expose the AYDC conditions, to seek justice and drive for meaningful reforms. I am so very sorry for what they have had to go through and what they have had to continue to endure. I also wish to acknowledge the tireless efforts of those community sector organisations and individuals who have in good faith offered their expertise, time and commitment to the government and therefore more broadly to the Tasmanian people in working to deliver expeditiously those much needed meaningful reforms. I genuinely hope that should this chamber vote in support of the government immediately forming a multidisciplinary task force to work together to implement necessary interim measures that will help remove children on remand from AYDC now, while the proposed Youth Justice Blueprint continues to be developed as a more permanent reform, that we can start to change that record. We can ensure that our watch becomes one of vigilance and that is consistent and upholding of our children's safety, dignity and human rights. Mr President, I commend the motion to the House.